The coffee shop smelled like wet pavement and roasted beans, the kind of place you could hide in without anyone noticing. I had been coming here for months, but today the quiet felt different. She was sitting by the window, the late afternoon light slanting over her face. Mid-40s, maybe a bit older. She stirred her coffee slowly, like she was trying to stretch the moment, and I caught myself tracing the curve of her smile without meaning to. I fiddled with the corner of my notebook, tapping the pen. My order came and went, black coffee, no sugar, but she had remembered it before I even reached the counter. It was nothing, really, and yet it felt like a private acknowledgement, a small crack in the monotony. She looked up then, and our eyes met for a fraction too long. I looked down at my hands, folding the napkin over and over, and the corners of her mouth lifted in that quiet, knowing way. "You remind me of nights long gone," she said softly, almost to herself. But her eyes found mine, and the weight in them made me pause. I wanted to ask what she meant. Wanted to trace back the words to some memory I wasn't part of. But I only nodded, awkwardly, like a kid caught eavesdropping on a conversation meant for someone else. She tilted her head, and I noticed the faint tremor in her hand as she set the cup down. The air between us held a rhythm I couldn't name. A pause stretched into something tangible. She laughed quietly at a text on her phone, her eyes flicking up toward mine for a second before she looked away. I wanted to say something, anything, but all I could do was shift my weight, pretending to arrange my notebook while stealing glances at her hands, her hair catching the last sunlight. There was a familiarity in the way she moved, like she had memorized small gestures from years ago and was now performing them absent-mindedly. I realized I had been watching for longer than I thought, and the thought made my chest tighten in a way I didn't want to name. She glanced at me again, lips pressed together, as if testing whether I would speak. I cleared my throat. I didn't mean to stare," I said, my voice low. She shook her head, a slight smile touching the corners of her mouth. "No harm done," she said. Her voice carried warmth, but there was an undercurrent, a hint of melancholy that didn't reach the eyes fully. We fell into a quiet pattern, her reading, me pretending to take notes, but I kept catching her glances, tiny sparks that made the coffee taste colder than it should. The clock ticked on, and I found myself noticing everything, the way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the faint scent of her perfume, the way her fingers hovered over her cup like she didn't want to let go. I imagined leaving and never speaking to her again, but the thought was a little too sharp, a little too painful. I didn't want to leave. But neither did I want to intrude. Then, just as I stood to gather my things, she spoke again, this time directly. "Do you want to walk with me tomorrow? Just for a bit?" Her eyes held something heavier than invitation, curiosity, perhaps, or a quiet hope I didn't fully understand. I froze, and my hands brushed against the notebook, lingering there. The world outside the window went on as if nothing had changed, but for me, everything had shifted. I wanted to say yes. I wanted to ask 100 questions and stay forever, but I only managed a small nod, words trapped somewhere behind my teeth. And just like that, she gathered her bag and walked toward the door, the sunlight catching her hair, leaving me with the echo of her presence, the weight of her words, and the strange, aching hope that lingered in the space she left behind. I met her the next afternoon near the corner park she had mentioned. The air smelled faintly of rain, damp earth and freshly mown grass. She was waiting by the bench, a light scarf draped over her shoulders, hands tucked around a paper cup of tea. When she saw me, her smile was small, almost apologetic, and for a moment I thought she might turn back. We walked side by side, careful not to speak too loudly, letting the rhythm of our footsteps fill the spaces between words. I kept glancing at her, noticing how the scarf slipped slightly every time she adjusted it, the faint crease by her temple that caught the light. "I used to come here with him," she said suddenly, almost to herself. "My son. We'd race the ducks and complain about how slow the squirrels were." Her voice softened, a memory lingering at the edges. I kept my gaze on the path, afraid that looking at her might give away how tightly my chest had clenched. Don't have any siblings, I admitted quietly. Or kids. Just, mornings like this, I guess. My words felt thin, but she nodded as if she understood more than I had said. There was something in her eyes, a recognition of emptiness, or maybe of restraint, that made me feel both comforted and painfully aware of the line between us. We reached a small fountain, its water dribbling lazily into the basin. She crouched slightly to adjust her shoe, and I found myself holding my cup a little tighter, not knowing whether to speak or stay silent. The age difference, the fact that she was my friend's mom, even the quiet suggestion of her divorce, all of it pressed into me like a weight I wasn't ready to lift. We shared the tea in silence, passing the paper cup back and forth. Each sip carried the taste of something forbidden, something delicate. I imagined us here at night, longer walks, shared confessions, the quiet turn of a hand brushing against mine. And yet, the thought made my stomach knot, excitement tangled with guilt in a way I hadn't anticipated. She laughed at a memory she suddenly remembered, her voice light but fragile. He used to hide my keys just to see me panic. I'd always find them in the cookie jar. I smiled faintly, feeling the simplicity of it anchor me for a moment. We moved to sit on the edge of the fountain, our shoulders brushing lightly. The sun had dipped lower, and a stray breeze made her scarf flutter. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words stalled in my throat. Finally, she reached over, brushing a droplet of water from my sleeve. It was a gesture so small, so ordinary, yet it carried a weight that neither of us needed to acknowledge. My hand hovered, almost touching hers, before I let it fall back to my lap. She didn't look away, instead, she gave me a soft, lingering gaze, the kind that felt like it could hold a confession without needing words. I walked home later with a quiet ache, thinking about the warmth of that touch, the closeness that felt almost criminal, and the realization that the world outside hadn't shifted, only the space between us had. The apartment smelled faintly of laundry and something sweet she had been baking. I had offered to help, mostly to have an excuse to be here, though now I wondered if that was obvious. She was at the counter, stirring something in a bowl, and the soft scrape of the spoon against ceramic made my chest tighten. I didn't mean to. I mean, you don't have to, I said, fumbling with the tea towels I'd been handed. My hands were clumsy, fumbling over edges, and I caught her watching me, her eyebrows just slightly raised. I know, she said softly, not pressing. But her eyes lingered. Longer than casual, almost searching. I wanted to ask her what she saw, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I traced the rim of my cup, letting silence stretch. She shifted, reaching for a stray spoon, and our fingers brushed. Quick, almost accidental, but enough to make my stomach coil. There was a knock at the door, quick and unexpected. She stiffened, a subtle but unmistakable pull back, like she had been waiting for it to happen all along. It's probably just the delivery, she said, though the edge in her voice betrayed a flicker of relief or maybe guilt. I stepped aside as she opened the door, and for a moment, the space between us felt almost tangible. Someone outside called a name, and she nodded politely, letting them leave packages by the door. By the time she returned, the easy rhythm we had built was fractured, replaced with an awkward gap I didn't know how to fill. We stood near the counter, pretending to busy ourselves with ingredients, but every glance, every small movement carried weight. She leaned slightly over the bowl, the curve of her shoulder catching the light, and I thought about how long it had been since anyone had looked at me like that. Not with expectation, but with a quiet, almost aching curiosity. I didn't. I wasn't sure, she started, her voice trailing, if you'd want to stay. Her hands gripped the counter, knuckles pale. I could feel the hesitation, the quiet fence she had built around herself. I swallowed, unsure if I was meant to reassure her or step back. Instead, I just nodded, letting the silence answer for me. We worked side by side, each stir, each measured pour, carrying a tension neither of us named. She brushed flour from her hand, and I reached out instinctively to steady her wrist. Not much. Just enough that our eyes met, and the room seemed to contract, everything else fading. My lips parted, words hovering, unfinished, while her breath hitched slightly. I leaned closer, too close, and then paused, aware of the line we hadn't crossed but had nearly touched. A near confession, a near kiss, the kind that lingers in memory even if nothing else happens. She looked away, toward the window, and I could see the flush in her cheek, faint but undeniable. The timer beeped softly in the oven. Ordinary sound. Ordinary life. And yet, in that small kitchen, with flour dusting her scarf and our proximity lingering, I realized how precariously balanced we were. A single misstep, and the quiet rhythm would shatter. It had rained earlier, leaving the sidewalk slick and shimmering. I found her at the park bench again, her scarf damp, hair sticking slightly to the back of her neck. She waved me over, and I hesitated a moment longer than necessary, aware of the weight that had grown between us. We sat, a small gap, enough to feel polite but not intimate. She took off her scarf and let it rest beside her, and I noticed the faint tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers drummed lightly against her knee. I saw your friend the other day, she said, voice low, almost hesitant. He mentioned something about you helping him with that project. You looked happy. Something twisted in my chest. I wanted to tell her it didn't matter, that I wasn't thinking about anyone else, but I didn't. Instead, I shuffled slightly, dragging a fingertip across a wet patch on the bench. Silence filled the space, loud in its own way. Her eyes caught mine, searching, almost accusing. She started, then stopped, letting the words hang. The rain droplets from the trees above dotted her scarf, falling slowly, mirroring the hesitation in her voice. I don't know why I care, she admitted finally, a small tremor in her voice. I shouldn't. It's ridiculous. You're young. I don't even know why she trailed off, shaking her head slightly. Her hands tightened into fists at her sides, nails pressing faint marks into her palms. I wanted to reach out. I wanted to say something that would make it okay, but I couldn't find the words. Instead, I shifted closer, careful, not wanting to overstep. You don't have to explain, I murmured, letting the silence carry my understanding. Her lips parted, a breath escaping that felt too loud, too intimate. Every time you look at me, her voice broke slightly, and she looked away, toward the pond. Ducks paddled lazily, oblivious. I realized then that it wasn't just curiosity or longing on her side. There was something raw, something exposed, like a wall she had built for years that I was slowly brushing against. I swallowed, feeling the tremor of my own emotions. You remind me of nights long gone, she whispered, the same words from our first meeting, but heavier this time. Not playful, not wistful, full of something unspoken, a confession without form. I wanted to say something back, wanted to fill the gap with a truth of my own, but all I could manage was to let my hand brush against hers. Not intentional, not a claim, but a presence. She didn't move away. She let it linger. We sat there for a long moment, breathing in sync with the quiet city around us. No words, no assurances, just the fragile proximity of two people teetering on the edge of something dangerous and unavoidable. And in that stillness, I realized the truth, the line had already blurred, even if we hadn't crossed it yet. I waited at the park bench that afternoon, the one we had claimed as ours without ever saying it aloud. The air smelled faintly of wet leaves, and a breeze tugged at my hair. She didn't arrive. Not after 10 minutes, 20, 30. I tried calling once, twice. The messages stayed unsent in my mind, growing heavier with each passing minute. Then I remembered a detail she had never mentioned until now, a daughter she had picked up from school just a few blocks away. Something I hadn't considered, something that reframed the space between us entirely. When she finally appeared, she kept her distance. The warmth I had felt in the past weeks felt like a mirage. She smiled, polite, the faintest hint of apology, and gestured toward a different bench. I followed, hesitant. I had errands, she said quickly, almost rehearsed. Couldn't make it here on time. Her eyes flicked away, avoiding mine for longer than usual. Something in her posture, the tightness at her shoulders, made my chest squeeze. We sat in silence. I wanted to bridge the gap, to ask what had changed, but her glance held the same distance she had kept at the start. Every laugh we had shared, every brush of hands in the kitchen, now felt fragile, almost dangerous. I didn't tell you everything, she admitted finally, voice low, almost swallowed by the wind. I didn't think I should. I've been divorced a long time, but there's more. Complicated things. I nodded, trying to absorb the words, trying to understand why the rhythm between us had shifted so suddenly. It wasn't anger or rejection. Just withdrawal. A quiet fence she had rebuilt overnight. I imagined 100 scenarios, each one worse than the last. Was it the daughter? An ex? Or just the realization that what we had felt was wrong, fragile, too easily broken? My chest tightened with every imagined answer, every fragment of her half-confession. She reached for her phone and checked it, tapping the screen with a precision that made her hands seem smaller, more guarded. I wanted to reach across the bench, to stop her, to ask her to stay, but I didn't. My hand hovered at my knee, almost moving, and then I let it drop. We left together eventually, walking parallel but not close. The space between us wasn't distance, it was an unspoken boundary. I caught her gaze once, soft, fleeting, like she wanted to explain something but couldn't. At the apartment door, she paused. "I'll see you, later," she said, a whisper that could have been promise or apology. And then she was gone, leaving the hallway empty, the echo of her presence lingering like the faint scent of her perfume. I leaned against the door, hand pressing into the wood. My phone lay on the table, a message half-typed, unsent. I didn't send it. I didn't know if I wanted to. I just sat, imagining the space where she had been, feeling the emptiness of the seat beside me, and realizing how abruptly the quiet intimacy had fractured. The apartment smelled faintly of baked bread and the faint tang of coffee. I had come to return the book I had borrowed, a flimsy excuse to see her again. She opened the door before I could knock properly, and the look on her face stopped me. Not surprise, exactly, but a careful caution. "I thought you might have left," she said, voice low, as if the walls themselves could overhear. She stepped aside, letting me in. The apartment was quiet, only the hum of the refrigerator and a distant car horn filtering through the window. We stood awkwardly in the doorway, and I felt the full weight of everything unsaid. The last weeks, the walks, the brushes of hands, the half-smiles, had built to this point, a quiet precipice. I wanted to speak, to say it all at once, but the words lodged in my throat. I started, then stopped. I wanted to reach for her, to bridge the distance, but feared the wrong step. She stepped closer instead, the faint scent of her perfume washing over me. My chest tightened. "I don't know if I should," she whispered, eyes tracing the edge of my face, careful not to linger too long. "I don't know if it's right." Her hand hovered near mine, trembling slightly, and I felt it like a current. We stood in silence. Ordinary sounds of life surrounded us, the clink of a mug from the kitchen, the distant laughter of children outside, but inside, everything was magnified. My fingers itched to touch hers, to close the space, to speak the words we had both avoided. Finally, she exhaled, soft, deliberate. "I like having this," she said, voice barely above a whisper. "Even if it's wrong." I swallowed, letting my lips part, words trembling. "I like it too," I said, simple, honest, but heavy with all the weight we hadn't dared name. A pause stretched between us, longer than comfortable, but necessary. She lowered her hand slowly, then reached again, not in a grand gesture, but a quiet, deliberate touch on my forearm. I didn't move. I let the contact linger, letting it speak for the rest of the things our mouths couldn't form. Her eyes softened. A faint smile tugged at her lips, the kind that carries both relief and apprehension, hope and the memory of all the boundaries we had nearly crossed. I mirrored it, small, almost shy, letting the tension fall just enough to breathe. "Okay," she murmured, a single word that felt like an entire conversation condensed into a sound. I nodded. My chest unclenched slightly, and I let myself stay in that quiet presence, knowing that words had been said, yet so much remained suspended between us. We lingered there for a moment longer, hands brushing slightly, eyes meeting just enough to understand each other without claiming more than we could safely hold. Then, slowly, she stepped back, letting me move toward the door, the warmth of her presence trailing behind me like sunlight caught in the folds of a scarf. Outside, the city went on. But in that apartment, in that shared silence, something had shifted. Not all barriers were gone, not all guilt erased, but for the first time, there was clarity, a fragile, human connection that felt like both a beginning and an acknowledgement of what could never fully be. It was 8:47 a.m. When I first noticed the bench again, the one in the corner of the park we had claimed without ever saying it aloud. The city moved lazily around us, distant footsteps, a dog barking, the faint scrape of a bike chain. She was already there, sipping black coffee from her usual thermos, the scarf I remembered loosely draped over her shoulders. I sat down beside her, careful not to startle her, and we fell into our old rhythm. No grand gestures, no confessions that hadn't already been whispered and tested in kitchen corners and rainy sidewalks. Just the quiet ease of two people who had learned to hold each other without needing to grasp too tightly. "You remembered the thermos," she said, eyes glinting with amusement. I nodded, letting the familiarity settle like a soft weight. A small, ordinary moment, but for us it carried the echoes of all the times we had brushed past boundaries, nearly crossed lines, and returned, each time, to the fragile trust we were building. She stirred her coffee slowly, letting the spoon scrape the cup in that way I had memorized months ago. I traced the edge of the bench with my finger, not needing to speak, letting the silence carry the acknowledgement of what we had survived. We talked about trivial things at first, a stray cat in the alley, a book she was reading, the weather. Then, without pressure, we spoke about life, the way mornings felt longer when alone, the small routines that anchored us. I realized that I no longer felt the ache of uncertainty that had shadowed our early days. It had softened, replaced with a steady warmth that didn't demand explanations. She leaned slightly toward me, her fingers brushing mine as she reached for her thermos again. Not a bold touch, not a claim, but a quiet reassurance. I let my hand rest against hers, just enough to feel the pulse beneath the skin, and that was enough. A pigeon landed nearby, flapping its wings nervously. We watched it together, and I thought of all the near misses, all the moments we had almost faltered. It felt ordinary, and ordinary was perfect. "You ever think about that day, the first time we met here?" I asked, voice low. She smiled softly, eyes distant, remembering. "Sometimes," she admitted. "It's strange, how much has changed." "Yes," I said, nodding. "And yet, it feels like nothing has changed too." A small laugh escaped her, the kind that was familiar, homey, and entirely hers. The sun shifted, spilling warmth across our bench. We stayed there, letting the city breathe around us, hands occasionally brushing, glances exchanged that spoke volumes without words. Black coffee, damp scarves, late afternoons at the park, everything ordinary had become extraordinary simply because we were together. When I finally stood to leave, she followed me with her eyes, letting me go without a word. And as I walked away, I carried a quiet certainty. We had crossed lines, we had faltered, and yet we had arrived here, steady, real, and imperfectly whole. And in that lingering warmth of a shared morning, I realized something only we would ever understand, that love didn't need grand confessions or dramatic gestures. It thrived in pauses, in glances, in the spaces we allowed each other to exist freely, quietly, together.